Xi is he's threading the needle here. He's trying to sound like a guy who's in charge, but he's not in charge. He knows that he could be gone. And Kim's the other guy who knows he could be gone in the morning. These guys, they live a very precarious existence, but they promise things, and they know that the communism, when it's running a government, doesn't go beyond the fifth generation. It breaks up because they can't sell the story all the way to the end.
G'day and welcome to episode 44 of The Other Side. I'm Damien Curry. In this episode, part 2 of our in-depth interview with renowned Australian-American international diplomacy professor Joseph Siracusa, who's helping us put the current behaviour of China into a wider historical context. Professor Siracusa has spent 48 years in Australian universities. He's an expert on China and the US, and he has a unique and deep understanding of where Australia sits in the scheme of things. Just a quick reminder that The Other Side can only exist with your support, and while we don't ask for financial support from our listeners and viewers, we would like your moral support and a bit of effort in liking and, most importantly, sharing the show on social media. If you like what we're doing, you like the ideas that we are presenting and you think they're important, please do follow and subscribe. Now, if you're afraid of the intolerance on social media these days and backlash from your friends because you dare to consider the other side of things, maybe a private message or email to a group of like-minded friends may be the way to go. In any case, we are continuing to grow, and I'm committed to continue to volunteer my time to do this show if you guys are committed to helping us get the word out. Professor Joseph Siracusa is currently Professor of Political History and International Diplomacy at Curtin University in Perth, and he also worked 15 years at RMIT in Melbourne and Griffith University in Brisbane. He's American-born, has been in Australia for 48 years now, and he spent his first 20 years at the University of Queensland. I'm very pleased that Professor Siracusa is joining us on the other side for a long two-part exploration of the China question. 50 years in academia, Professor Siracusa knows a thing or two about the history of relations between China and the West, and especially how it involves Australia. I haven't edited our chat. This is one for people who like a long-form podcast interview, but I have broken the discussion into two parts. Part 1 dropped about a week ago in episode 42 of The Other Side, if you want to go back and have a listen to that. And today, part 2. So in the first part of our conversation, we discussed what would happen if Australia intervened in any conflict between China and Taiwan. But in this second part of the conversation, we discussed the question of how much of a threat China is to Australia if we take Taiwan out of the mix. We also look at whether we'll ever find out about where COVID really came from and why China is building military bases on disputed islands between it and its neighbours. Joe, what's the threat to Australia directly? Take Taiwan out of the picture. What do you see as the threat from China to Australia? Is there any risk that China might decide that it wants to, move on our resources, I guess, but it would exert that pressure economically way before it would get into a hot war, wouldn't it?
Well, China's never going to have a hot war with Australia. Okay.
Right.
I mean, we were threatened about, a month ago by the Global Times that they were going to send ballistic missiles to bases in Australia. And I suggested at that time in a number of places that the Morrison government should have thrown the ambassador out of the country. You can't threaten governments. It said if Australia moves with the Americans on Taiwan, we will rain ballistic missiles on you. That's thuggery. You show them the door. You don't have to close the embassy. You just throw them out. Because you can't talk warlike like that to your host country. I mean, that's what gangsters do. That's gangster diplomacy. So yeah. I said it would be very important for Australia to expel the ambassador, to do something you can do in the diplomatic arena before you need an 800-pound gorilla in the room to do the same thing. This is something Australia can do and would be much admired for. A couple months ago, the Czech government threw a bunch of Russians out of the embassy there because they were involved in shenanigans. Then, of course, the Russians threw out a number of people number of checks in their embassy. It's something that Australia can do in a dignified, powerful way. It sends an important message to the Chinese to clean up their act and reset the button. Now, I think China is very angry with Australia because I think it was the foreign minister who talked about an inquiry into COVID. And of course, we're never going to figure out the inquiry into COVID. I mean, President Biden has asked the intelligence forces to redouble their efforts over the next 90 days to find out where COVID came from. The intelligence forces, there are 13 of them, get $86 billion. And they've been wrong about so many things. I can't get into how critical I am. So they're not going to find out.
Yeah, just one question. Why then are we seeing the development of these islands? Obviously China's moving in on a lot of the disputed islands in the South China Sea and near Japan as well. And they're not just moving in on those islands, but they're building what appear to be Air Force and military type bases on them. Is that just signaling, or are they intending to use that?
They're messaging us not to mess with them in the South China Sea. Now, we can take those bases out overnight, okay? That's not a problem. The problem is that when they get a little reef and they develop it and they say, well, this is the X reef and we own everything. We control the waters 2 miles around the reef plus the economic extending zone for 200 miles.
That's the freedom of navigation question.
That's freedom of navigation. What they're trying to do is set up all these concentric circles. And of course, the Navy isn't buying any of this. The Navy knows this is all phony. So they're trying to make life difficult, but they know that they can drive Australia crazy with barley and wine and wheat and all these people. And just think about, this is my pet peeve, is that we have 37 Australian universities, and they were all dependent on Chinese students, billions of dollars, $34 billion export industry to China. And a lot of universities use this funny money to do a lot of things, like establish campuses all over the world and first-class accommodation and all the rest of it. And when it fell over, and I said on Channel 9 a couple of years ago and said, how can China hurt Australia? Well, I said, first of all, they can tell their students to stay home. Half of Australia's universities will fall over because they've been using the funny money. When I say funny money, they ask the Chinese to pay 2 and 3 times more for a degree than the Australian kid, okay?
I've taught in Hong Kong. Even Hong Kong was doing that with the Chinese kids. So,
exactly.
So, with that, I mean, is there a security and military threat to Australia to entertain so many mainland Chinese students, or is it the other way around? Or should we be diversifying to other countries a little bit more, do you think?
I think the only way to settle this is people to people, soft diplomacy. And there has been nothing more effective than the Rhodes scholarships, the Fulbright scholarships, all these scholarships around the world that encourage people and even adversaries to study in each other's universities. Now, I know the Chinese studied at MIT and picked up too many courses in physics, their own weapons, but you can't do anything about that. I thought that, and I've had dozens of Chinese and Vietnamese students, good communist students who make very good students because they don't think like communists when they come here. They think like rational people, and they write reasonable papers, and they're quite brilliant. And people who have a good experience here, that is a good educational experience, they go back to their countries, and it's part of their mindset for the rest of their lives. And so I think the education is very, very important. I also think because universities have responded to this fall in income by getting rid of 18,000 members of staff, that they're falling over. They've lost a great deal of credibility. In fact, this is the great untold story is what's happened. Now a lot of vice chancellors are going back to England because they want to go home, or they want to see more of their family, so they're quitting. What's happened is they've lost their pants. They knew better. They should have diversified, but they didn't. They took all the money and they ran in different directions. I'll give you an example. An average Australian ambassador, average Australian vice chancellor makes about $1.2 million a year.
What?
That's right. Now,
An
Oh,
Australian
because
vice chancellor of a university makes more than $1 million a year.
the story is that's what they were worth as corporate heads. Okay, that's a story.
Hardly.
Now the president of the United States makes $400,000 a year. Okay, he's got a nice credit card. The president of University of Chicago makes $200,000 a year. The director of the FBI makes $186,000 a year. And the Speaker of the House in Illinois, Springfield, he makes $85,000 a year. You see what I'm talking about here? And then 10 years ago, universities stopped hiring their own people. They got corporate headhunters to bring people in. Lots of talented people who didn't know a goddamn thing about universities. They're not scholars. They're just good corporate people. And then they invented something. They started giving bonuses to deans and deputy vice chancellors and pro vice chancellors to do what? Well, to make the system work a little faster, a little leaner. So as soon as you start giving bonuses in the education industry, you've already cut your throat, because pretty soon you got people who are driving other people into the dirt. Now, when I arrived here in '73, this is I'm not casting aspersions on anybody today, but all the vice chancellors were public intellectuals and leading scholars in their fields. Zelman Cowan, physicists, humanities people, they were all great scholars. There were no bonuses and no corporate mentality. But today, because the Chinese students, and they're not coming back, because the Chinese can do that, they can withdraw them. And they can make life miserable for people who sell wine and other things, barley to China. And if they ever tell us what to do with the iron ore, then the game is over. So instead of trying to figure out how to adjust to these things, the government of the day is buying F-35s, submarines. We're thinking of ways to provide asymmetrical problems for the Chinese. I mean, when in the '70s, the Singapore government used to talk about their defense policy as the poisoned shrimp, to make themselves impossible to digest if they were conquered by the Chinese. All kinds of brilliant things come up when people don't have enough money to do it. So Australia's worried about the coming war with China when there is no war coming. In fact, Australia's in a sense dredging up a war with China, and they don't know what the Americans are doing. The Americans are following. You mentioned this one guy who was head of the Pacific Fleet. I don't like the phrase Indo-Pacific. It's one of those weasel phrases that Keating's speechwriter used to talk about. It doesn't mean anything. I like the Pacific Fleet. That's where the action is. Indo-Pacific is crap. No one knows what that is. It's weasel stuff. Anyway, the Australians, the action's going to be in the Pacific. And there isn't going to be a war there unless we bring on a war. You know how we can actually wish something to happen by hoping for something else to happen? I mean, we're prodding these guys. And as I said, the Chinese are going crazy because they see that Australia is needling them. Fair enough. Let's needle them diplomatically if we can. But I pointed out to Chinese delegates with Australian diplomats in the room the great story in Aesop's fable, where you got the mouse and the lion. And the lion says to the mouse, "What the hell would I ever need you for?" And when the lion gets a thorn in its paw, the mouse saves the lion's life. And I said to this group, Australia can do things as an interlocutor, can be the person that explains the West to China and China to the West. In the United States, we got a whole bunch of people who are hunkering down. Everybody who's talking about the threat from China and the United States, they're talking about the next budget. It's shopping time in the military-industrial complex. So when they talk about the rising threat, they're talking about what they need. Every discussion ends with, and of course, every bright senator used to say in the '60s to these guys who wanted more money to fight communism, they'd say to them, Senator Fulbright would say to these chiefs, well, would you, since you've told us how much the communists are a threat to us, would you take their position and their assets and give them ours? He said, no. It's all exaggerated. It's exaggerated to make the Chinese are not 6 feet tall. We can deal with this. And Australia has an important role to play diplomatically in terms of soft power. Now, Kevin Rudd, who's alienated everybody in this country, apparently. He had a beautiful discussion the other day. I thought it was very good, where he says that if Australia approaches China in a non-military way, it should do it in concert with others. In other words, if Australia wants to complain about some Chinese policy, it ought to complain as part of a group of people, a group of nations complaining about it. And coming up against China one-on-one doesn't, the optics aren't very good. And the Chinese don't know what's going on. In fact, they think that Australia is America's barking dog on this, or Trojan horse. They think that Australia is sort of stalking China on behalf of the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. But look, if you told ordinary Australians tonight, there's not going to be a war with China, except over freedom of navigation. There's a direct conflict between the American and the Chinese Navy. There's going to be no war over Taiwan. There was going to be no war over Hong Kong. There's going to be no war over Nepal. I'm sorry, Richard Gere and all those people. It's not going to happen. And yes, the Chinese are going to throw their weight around the world. And I told this delegation from Beijing, I said, when you lend money to people who can't pay it back, and then you want to take property or collateral in its place, as they did in Ceylon or Sri Lanka and places like that. I said, 50, 60% of China's debt to the outside world is soft debt. It's never going to get the money back. It's all dead money. So, but I said to the Chinese leadership, I said, the day is going to come when your party wants that money called in, and you can't get it, okay? You can't get the money because they can't pay it back. And I said, what you're going to do when you try to get it back is you're going to create a worldwide tsunami of anti-Chinese feeling, creating just the opposite effect you think that the Belt and Road is doing. They think the Belt and Road is going to make people beholden to the Chinese. And I said, when you go to collect the debts, you're going to create a worldwide revulsion to Chinese influence. You're going to have the opposite effect. I said,
Joe, the Belt and Road is also about, isn't it also about, locking countries into debt with China? I mean,
well, yeah, that's well, they don't want to. I don't think they want to do it. I think they like to get paid. It's not to lock them into debt. They know they're going to be locked into debt. You give money to Ukraine, and people are going to steal it, or to Niger, or you just give money to certain people to do things, and the money never gets where it's going.
Yeah.
And they're not trying to subvert these countries. They know they're very poor at paying things. If you give people money, they have to have a willingness and ability to pay back. And I'm sure
the Belt and Road Initiative, they're building a lot of stuff themselves. They're keeping the supply chain vertical to China. So they're sending in Chinese workers. I mean, in Manila in the Philippines, I lived next door to a bridge that was being built by China. There wasn't a Filipino worker on the site. They were all Chinese. They'd all been brought in.
That's right. That's part of.
I'm pretty sure they're buying all their steel from China too.
That's part of their migration policy. You're quite right. They're sending sort of like Seabees and construction workers all out there. That's exactly right. But there will be in these countries there'll be a revulsion to that. First of all, they're going to stop paying it, and then there's going to be riots everywhere, anti-Chinese riots. The way there are is all the time. Remember, 20 years in Malaysia, there was anti-Chinese riots. Yeah. The Chinese are going to create a very hostile environment around the world. But look, the Belt and Road was part of that continuation of globalization. And globalization is really great. It's great for a lot of people. 90% of people
brought a lot of the world out of poverty for all of its all the criticism. It's been valuable in many ways, right?
Yeah, but in America, when your job went to Venezuela or
sure.
Argentina, it was the problem with globalization, the same thing with the Chinese, is it looks pretty good and it helps a lot of the elites and allows you to go to Davos every year and go to nice seminars with Bill Gates. The trouble is with globalization is that the elites have never really explained the benefits of it to the little guy. So, people like Biden come along and say, hey, I got $6 trillion to get you blue-collar workers a job for the rest of your life, and you can have an associate degree. And what you got to do is you got to build those roads again, and you got to rebuild the bridges for us. He's creating an entire blue army class of slaves who missed out on globalization. And infrastructure's got nothing to do with globalization. It's something else. But globalization's never been slow. It's helped you and me, and I like to move around the world. People know me and my books, and I get to talk everywhere. But it doesn't help a guy who had a job in Youngstown, Ohio, making glass or rubber tires. It's gone somewhere else. Or making cars now in Mexico instead of in Detroit. So globalization hasn't been sold properly. And I think the same thing is going to happen. The Chinese are selling the Belt and Road as part of their globalization. This is what they can't understand is they're doing what the West has been doing for the last 20, 30 years. And people don't like them. I mean, this guy said to me, what are we doing wrong? We're doing everything the Americans and others have been doing, but people don't like us.
They're doing globalization in an era of renationalization, I guess, in a sense.
That's right. They don't understand what's going wrong, why the image, and the very fact, Damien, that these people would come to me, of all people, because I've been fairly even-handed about criticism, about bad behavior. They'd come to me for a critical examination of what they're doing wrong. These people, during the Cultural Revolution, they used to do self-examinations. Here you have a delegation that comes to Melbourne, and they say to me, what have we done wrong? Give me a critique. Then I explain what all the think tanks they say they've done wrong, what politicians say they've done wrong, all these things. And the idea that they're now open to criticism suggests to me that there is a lot of uncertainty within the party about how to sell themselves going forward. I think globalization was sold by the Chinese to capture that fifth generation Communist Party member, to energize their base. And I think it's failed because not all Chinese can, of course, take advantage of the globalization. But look, my main points this evening are, we have to understand that President Nixon has settled the Taiwan issue forever, that the Chinese are not a clear and present danger to Australia or anyone else, and the United States is not going to go to war with them over Taiwan. Taiwan is off the table, not because we don't love freedom and democracy and all that. It's that it's been settled by them that Taiwan is part of one China. I guess the other day Morrison got himself in trouble by talking about the two China, the two system policy in Taiwan. I don't know what he's talking about. And I know he doesn't know what he's talking about. I couldn't figure out how he got that wrong, so wrong. But the point is, I'm not saying.
That was the Hong Kong policy, was the one China, two systems, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. He got it wrong. But the point is, President Nixon and Kissinger, both of whom knew that there could be a nuclear war over Taiwan, because if there's a fight with China, they were going to drop the kitchen sink on them. They wanted to put it off the table. They don't want a nuclear war over Taiwan, because people say the war, there'll be low-level conflict, conventional, and the Chinese will use a small nuclear weapon to get us to de-escalate. And I was with a bunch of people from the U.S. Department of Defense who believe all this Russian and Chinese nonsense about when they use a small nuclear weapon in a conflict with us, it's a signal to us to de-escalate. They're going to escalate to de-escalate. So I said to this one Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear weapons at a security conference in the Baltics, I said, this doesn't make any sense. I grew up in Chicago. If someone punches you in the mouth, it's not about telling you there's not going to be a second punch. You don't escalate to de-escalate. You escalate to escalate. And if I have nuclear weapons and somebody is starting to sink aircraft carriers, how do you explain to the American people that you allowed 5,000 people to drown if you could have done something about it? So I think nuclear war would initiate very quickly. So if there's a conventional war with China and the South China Sea, we might even lose it because we can't defend Taiwan. We got F-35s, which have very short range, and they could only be fueled by planes that look like barns on a radar screen. They'll be knocked out of the sky. Chinese have all the advantage in a war over Taiwan. We can't win that one. And so if we bring it up to the nuclear level, which we would, we're all losers at the end of the day. So I just like a little more clear thinking. There is nothing complicated about this. If you want to understand if there's going to be a war with Taiwan, understand the history of Sino-American relations and Taiwan, and how Taiwan was it was the linchpin in the normalization of relations with China. It was a linchpin when we broke relations in 1979. It is not a basis for war, a casus belli. If there is a war with China, it's going to be about direct conflict with the Chinese Navy. That's the big problem right now. The Chinese Navy takes on the 7th Fleet, or even sinks an Australian frigate of some kind, then we're going to have a conflict. But if this is about naval doctrine, this is about freedom of the seas, this is not about getting more F-35s. It's not about worrying about Chinese nuclear or ballistic missiles hitting Australia. China, I'll just tell you finally here a story. Remember during the 70s, are you old enough to remember when everybody used to say that because Australia was America's alliance partner, that Australia was becoming increasingly a nuclear target? That was the big drum in the 70s and early 80s. And then the ABC one night, they had a Russian general on the show. And somebody famous at the ABCs to him says, "Is Australia a nuclear target?" And he turned to somebody who I'm sure you know. And he says, "We don't think about Australia."
Yeah.
What do you mean? We don't think about Australia. If there were a war, Australia, we're not going to do anything. You're here. You can't do anything to us. We're not going to do anything to you. And so it was the wind out of the sail. And then that argument came back again in the 2000s when people argued that, oh, well, if America is a terrorist target, then Australia must become a terrorist target because of our relationship with America. It's the same argument. They rolled out the same argument, but they just changed the nouns a little bit.
Well, I recall there was a terrorist, leading terrorist, I'm not sure which one, who had that question posed to him at a news conference in exactly the same style as the ABC question to the Russian, and got the same answer.
That's
was
right.
laughed at.
He said,
"Don't think about you."
About Australia. Look, there's a famous guy that Walter Lippmann, the famous journalist. And when he was at Harvard in 1917, he was the editor of the famous Harvard Crimson. And the young Walter Lippmann says, he had a great line that I've been using all my life. And he said, "Politicians and businessmen don't really mean badly. And most of the time, they don't mean anything at all." So that got me through Trump and other politicians who didn't know what they were talking about. They're just talking nonsense. They don't know where it goes. And look, it's because Australians, since War on Terror, since the end of the Cold War, have stopped thinking historically. They don't look at the period before that or the period before that. You can't study war and peace in Australian universities. Now you can, I don't know, what you can study. I've been there for 48 years, and I wish people knew more about how things worked in the 20th and 21st century. But they don't understand that these are basic lessons to be learned. And yes, history does not repeat itself. But as the great Mark Twain says, it rhymes a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And we need more critical thinking, less critical theory, perhaps, I suppose, in our university.
Well, when I say these kinds of things on television and it goes to YouTube, I get these thousands of comments calling me China Joe. I'm an apologist for the Chinese because we're not going to go to war over Taiwan. Look, going to war over Taiwan isn't abandoning them. It's their deal. That's the deal. They're going to, their parents and grandparents want to rejoin the mainland. I mean, it's nothing we can do about it. We can't give California back to the Mexicans. It's not going to happen. And Taiwan is going to go where the gravity goes. That's what I meant by propinquity. It's the low-hanging fruit. They're going to just come together. They're separated by 140K. And because President Nixon knew that nuclear war was planned and the targeting was done, he knew what was going to happen if that issue hadn't been settled. I always thought he should have got the goddamn Nobel Peace Prize for getting Taiwan off the table.
Right.
And he never did. And he was up against the China lobby and all the conservatives and these kinds of people. And Dick Nixon, when he could see reality, he raced towards it. And Kissinger, it wasn't Kissinger's idea, but Kissinger told him how to get there. So he had that cachet. He was the only Harvard guy working for him, was Kissinger. And he had that cachet. And Nixon, it was a brilliant piece of policy. I mean, as a young man, I was stunned at how successful he was. And I was stunned that he went into the devil's lair. He went right to the leader of the Asian communist world and sat down and had a couple of smokes, I guess. I guess he was a chain smoker, or Mao was. And they settled their differences. I mean, today, is anybody going anywhere to solve a problem? People don't like Trump because he's a bad guy. He has no manners. But when he went to see Chairman Kim using personal or summit diplomacy, the way Churchill liked summit diplomacy, he went to see Kim and he made it very clear to him quietly, privately, that if he can have his nuclear weapons as long as he doesn't point them at him. And of course, if Kim gave him too much, the military would put a bullet in the back of his head. This is what Xi Jinping has to worry about now, is the military putting a bullet in the back of his head. We underestimate how much these people are in control of these countries, whether it's Kim or Xi Jinping. It's the military that makes the final shot, because everything hangs on the military support. So if Xi doesn't deliver on his promise of the greater Chinese experiment, I mean, that's why he wants to deliver these things. That's why he wants to snuff these people out. The military is going to take a very hard view of him. And the military is always nationalist, whether they're communist or fascist or not, whatever, Nazi, whatever it is. And they take a nationalist view at the end of the day. And so, Xi he's threading the needle here. He's trying to sound like a guy who's in charge, but he's not in charge. He knows that he could be gone. And Kim's the other guy who knows he could be gone in the morning. These guys, they live a very precarious existence, but they promise things, and they know that the communism, when it's running a government, doesn't go beyond the fifth generation. It breaks up because they can't sell the story all the way to the end. And because, I not only believe it, I've seen it. And I should have said one other thing too. I've been going on about the 70 years forever, okay? And then I was watching Graham Ellison, the guy from Harvard, talking to the Oxford Union the other night. And Graham points out to the Oxford Union, I say 70 years because of 5 generations, that's true. But there's something else going on in Xi's mind. Of the 249 dynasties in China over the thousands of years, the average age of a dynasty is what? 70 years old. So not only does he have to worry about the pathology of the Communist Party lasting more than 70 years or 5 generations, he has to worry about historical pathology of dynasties not lasting on average more than 70 years. See, he's got 70 caught in his head. And China now is 71 years old. And it knows what can happen. And he knows he can be deposed, and he knows there could be a regime change. They'll still be the same tough nationalists at the end of the day. Nothing's going to change, except he's not going to be there. And that's why he's so noisy and virulent about what he wants to do. And that's why his diplomats are screaming at everybody, because they know what he wants them to do. He wants them to put the fear of the Lord into everybody. And it's not working very well. When people raise their voices, as you know in life, it just means they're losing it. He's lost control. I'm worried about the guy who's in control. This controlled aggression. Those are the kind of guys you should worry about. I'm more worried about Putin than I am about Xi, because Putin's got more things to play with, and he's got more grandeur to claw back. And Putin is a real danger. And I don't know if Australia has a real good policy on Putin. Was it Abbott that wanted to confront him once at
the shirt fronting?
Yeah, the shirt fronting. Yeah, that would have been interesting. But the point is that what I'm saying is not revolutionary. It's just based on the history of events, which are not taught or understood very well in this country. And you expect the people around the prime minister, and I know some of them do know what's going on, that there's a disconnect between the kinds of people who have this knowledge and getting the information to the top, how it affects policy. When Pizzullo, is that his name, talks about the war drums. What war drums? There are no war drums. They're in his head. He's been watching too many British black and white movies from the 1940s. There are no war drums. Yeah. This is just all nonsense. But it dominates the headlines. It dominates this and that. And I just think that these guys ought to go on retreat for a couple weeks somewhere and have a little think about how the history of Sino-American relations and Taiwan affects policy today. Because if the Americans and the Chinese have settled this, what's Australia doing? Can't be explained. And that's what's driving the Chinese crazy. What's Australia's game? And of course, the Chinese should be mentioning the Shanghai Communique and that things are set in stone here. They don't want to, or I don't know why not.
So they're overestimating our level of awareness
they probably think we've factored that in already.
Yeah.
But we haven't factored that in. No. And that's why they think that Australia's playing a very strange game. They don't understand what Australia's doing, given that they have already settled this debate. So that's why they think that Australia is a very odd bird here.
Yep, a very odd bird we are sometimes indeed. That's Professor Joe Siracusa, Professor of Political History and International Diplomacy at Curtin University in Perth. 48 years in Australia, sharing his wisdom on the US, China and Australia there for us over 2 episodes. I really hope you enjoyed the chat and found it enlightening. If you missed part 1, just a reminder, it is in episode 42, so just a couple of clicks away. I'm Davey Nkuri. Please remember to click that subscribe button on all the platforms if you like the show. If you're following us on YouTube, click the bell so you get notified when we post our new content. Sign up for the Discernible Crew. That's our platform, our network, Discernible. It's Discernible with an A, and there's lots of other great shows like The People's Project and Coffee with Josh and all sorts of good little interviews and stuff that my colleague Matthew Wong does and Josh does. So make sure you get onto that, the Discernible platform at discernable.io. If you'd like to be added to the VIP WhatsApp group that I control for the other side, all you have to do is email your WhatsApp number to me at theothersideost@gmail.com. I'll then email you back a link and you can click on that link and join and opt in. That's the way we have to do it. Okay, so theothersideost@gmail.com. Thanks a lot for joining us once again on The Other Side Australia, and we'll see you next time for episode 45 in a few days.